One of the perils of having back-to-back classes on the other side of campus. But today we're going to start our final section of the course, which is on how we use vision to control our motor actions. And there are a variety of topics that we'll consider as we go along. But first, I want to introduce a concept that was introduced by James Gibson in his 1950 book. You've heard the name of Gibson many times throughout this course. In fact, many people in the field sometimes refer to me as a Gibsonian, which I don't take offense at, except for there's this problem that there's another group that calls themselves Gibsonians that are sort of like a religious cult that I want to have no association with at all. I actually knew Gibson. I stayed at his house one night when I was a young postdoc. He was an interesting guy. So one of the things that Gibson introduced all kinds of things to the field of psychology. One of them we talked about earlier were texture gradients. That was a concept that Gibson brought to us. And another one that he brought to us was a concept of optical flow. And I'll define that more as we go along. This is a figure from his book where you see a bird flying, and the motion on the back of the eye forms a vector field. This is typically in the context of motion and vision is referred to as an optical flow field. And the idea is where the bird is heading, there's not much motion going on, right? So if I'm walking toward you, you're staying fixed in my visual field, but everything else is swarming in the periphery. You can see this when you're driving, right? If you look straight ahead and then sort of attend to what's happening off to the side, the trees and poles, they just whip by, whereas what you're looking at straight ahead doesn't change much at all. Now, before I introduce Gibson's idea to you, what I want to do is talk about one of the really classic problems in motion perception. People worried a lot about this in the 19th century, not so much now, but they did in the 19th century. And it seems like a stupid problem. But the issue is, how do you know the difference between when you're moving and when something else is moving? Now, sometimes you can get fooled from this. How many of you have been to COSI? A couple of you have. Do they still have that bridge that you walk through and they have all the lights that sort of swirl around it? You've seen that? And how do you experience when you walk through this thing?
It's weird because like the lights make you feel like the bridge is moving along, even though you're walking across, you feel like you're not moving.
You feel like you're moving.
Yeah.
There's a great example of this. A good friend of mine died a few years ago at York University in Canada, who built this crazy, he built all kinds of crazy devices, but one of my favorites was he built this room that you could rotate 360 degrees. And so in the room, there's a window, there's a flower pot sitting on the windowsill. There's a dresser and things on top of the dresser. Everything in this room is completely nailed down. And the reason why that is because you get in, you sit in a chair, and then the researcher proceeds to rotate the room about you. Any ideas what you experience when that happens? What's that? You think you're moving. And what's really weird is he turns the room upside down. Now, not everybody goes all the way. Some people feel like they rotate a little bit. I actually felt all the way. So he rotates the room by 180 degrees, right? So what was the ceiling is now the what was the ceiling is now the floor, what was the floor was now the ceiling, and I'm sitting in this chair, and I have this distinct impression that I'm sitting on a chair on the roof without a strap. But I know how this thing operates, right? So I know I'm not in danger of falling from the roof and hitting my head. But nevertheless, I had the distinct experience of rotating upside down. I wasn't moving at all. It was just the room that was moving. All right? And so this is a good example of how, under certain circumstances, you can actually confuse your own motion with the motion of other objects. Another example I'll give you, I'm pretty certain all of you have experienced. So how many of you have been sitting in a parked car and the car next to you starts to back out of the parking space? I see you nodding your head. What do you feel when that happens?
Feels like I'm going forward.
You feel like you're going forward, and sometimes it freaks you out, right? Because your foot's not on the accelerator. There's a wall in front of you, and you think you're going to crash into the wall. You're not moving at all. It's that motion you see off in the periphery. Your brain is interpreting it as I'm moving, not that there's a car backing out in the other space. So that's one that all of you, I think, can relate to. So here's the idea. When you're looking at, say, this moving lion, it moves back and forth on the retina. Similarly, the case is if you're looking at a stationary lion and you're moving your eyes back and forth, you get exactly the same effect. So how can you tell them apart? Now, I have to tell you that eye movements are a little bit different than any other kind of movement. And the reason for that is that in eye movements, every point on the eye moves at exactly the same velocity. So if you move your head back and forth, so everybody move your head back and forth. All right? So you see some people are moving in the scene faster than others on the back of your eye. That's called motion parallax, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But eye movements aren't that way. So when you move your eyes, everything just moves at a constant velocity on the back of the eye. Now, one of the nice things about that is that because the pattern of motion is so simple when you move your eyes, you could potentially compensate for that. So here's how that's done. Whenever you generate an eye command, so your muscles are telling your eyes, move, and your eyes actually do move, then your brain can then say, well, all right, I'm not going to pay any attention to that motion. That's not real. That's due to my eye movements. All right, so you compare the motion that you're seeing through your visual perception with the commands that you're telling your eyes to do, and they can offset one another. Now, there's a very famous experiment that really clearly demonstrated the effects of these motion commands. These are sometimes referred to as efferent signals. So efferent is a big word. It means outgoing. You're going from the brain out to the muscles, as opposed to efferent, where you're going from a sensory receptor back to the, afferent is referring to going from the outside world back to the brain. Efferent is going from the brain out to the muscles. And so the idea is that when you make a command to move the eyes, you have this signal that you can use that you compare with the actual motion that comes in to help interpret what's going on. Now, what von Holst did is, I don't think many of you would probably volunteer to do this experiment. What he did was he injected himself with a curare drip. All right, any neuroscientists in the room know what curare, so what's curare?
It's a toxin. I think it blocks sodium channels.
And what are the effects of it?
Paralyzation or...
Right, so it paralyzes your voluntary muscles. They use this in South America. I think they get it from some kind of toad, and they put it in those blow guns that they use, the Indians in South America use. So he put himself on a curare drip. Now, what do you have to do if you're going to do this experiment? So presumably he's not going to drip curare in his blood and then just lay there and die. So in order to do this experiment, you have to get in a respirator. So that's an artificial lung that helps you breathe. Again, the things people do for science. All for a very simple phenomenon. So, right, his muscles are completely paralyzed. He's in this iron lung, and he's looking out at the environment, and then he says to himself, I'm going to move my eyes from here to there. And so he tries to move his eyes, and what do you think he experiences? Any guesses?
Feels motion.
I'm sorry.
Does he feel motion?
What kind of motion? His motion or the world in motion? Remember, he made a motion command to his eyes. The motion command ought to counteract any real motion signal that's coming in. All right, so if you send a command to move your eyes, and then your visual input is not telling you any motion, what's the only way that could happen? Is if the whole environment moved in the opposite direction. And that's what he experienced. Right? So whenever he tried to move his eyes, he experienced the world just move. Now, you can experience this for yourself if you're not too squeamish. I don't advise putting yourself on a curare drip, but do the following. I want you to close one eye and take your finger on the other eye and push it back and forth. What do you experience? You see the world jittering around when you're doing that? And why is that happening? The reason it's happening is your eye's moving, but you didn't generate a motor command to your eye muscles to make the eye move. You're doing it with a different set of muscles. And those muscles don't work in sync with the motion signals, right? So you have no motor commands to the muscles, but the whole world is moving in a uniform way as far as your motion input is concerned. And so your eye says, well, that must really be the motion of the world. So that's the opposite effect of what happens when you're on the curare drip. So a pretty compelling phenomena to suggest that there is something to this story about matching the eye movement commands with the incoming motion that you sense. Now, this doesn't work if you see the object expanding or contracting. It's just for translatory motion. Now, Gibson let's get the whole thing on there. Now, this was the standard explanation of how you tell your own movement from the motion of other objects for probably 100 years. And what Gibson came along and said, well, you know, you don't really need this efferent signal in order to do that. You can exploit other information. Now, that being said, right, von Holz's demonstration and the demonstration you get from moving your eyes around with your finger is pretty compelling, right? So something's making the world look like it's moving in those situations. But Gibson pointed out a number of other factors. So let's suppose that you just look at the pattern of motion on the back of the eye, and every point on the back of the eye is moving at exactly the same velocity. What's happening? Any guesses? Remember, I told you eye movements are unique. So the only thing that can cause that behavior is that you're moving your eyes. Any other kind of body motion would not produce that effect. So if you see something like this, where all points are moving at exactly the same velocity, that's visual information that's telling you that your eyes are moving. Either that, or the whole world is moving, is rotating about you. Which scenario is more likely? That the whole world is rotating about you, or you're moving your eyes. Now, maybe the former one might be likely if you know that you're in Ian Howard's lab at York University in Canada. But other than that, it's probably a safe bet to assume that your eyes are moving. What happens here? Everything on the eye is stationary, but there's a single spot that's moving. So what that indicates is a flow pattern while watching a moving object with a stationary eye. So if you keep your eye stationary, I'll pick on you. You keep your eye stationary, right? And I move this object back and forth in your visual field, right? You'll get a pattern that looks like this, where most of your visual field is stationary except for the one moving spot. And that's telling that you're looking at a moving object. All right, here's the tricky one. I'll pick on you again. Now I'm going to move the same object back and forth, but this time I want you to track it with your eyes. Okay? When you do that, this is the pattern that you see. Now, because you're tracking the object with your eyes, the object is not moving on your retina, but everything else in your visual field is. So when you see a pattern that looks like this, where everything on the back of the eye is moving in the same direction, at the same velocity, and you have one spot that's stationary, that means that's a flow pattern that happens while tracking a moving object, while you're fixating on the object. All right, suppose we get a flow field that looks something like this. I need a volunteer. Who can I pick on? Let's pick on you. Come on up here. Come on up. All right, a simple demonstration. So what I want you to do is, I want you to face the class and then just step sideways without moving your head, just looking forward.
Okay.
And step sideways and so what do you see when that happens? How is the field moving?
I see more the stuff that's closer and further in my periphery seems to be moving at a faster rate than that stuff.
The stuff in the back.
Yeah.
That's called motion parallax. Very good. Have a seat. So this is what you see if you're looking, say you're traveling in a train or a car, and you're looking out the side window of the car, right? The stuff near to you is moving quickly. This is because of perspective. Stuff near to you is moving quickly, and the stuff in the back moves much more slowly. We'll see, this is a very important source of information. And then finally, let's take this one. All right, so everything in the eye is stationary, but you've got this spot, and inside the spot is expanding. So that's what's happening when you experience that. You trust me. Now, this is an important moment in the history of perception, right? So what Gibson is saying is that there are a lot more sources of information than just this connection between your eye muscle commands and your motion sensors coming in. There are all kinds of sources of information that can tell you what you're doing. And he spent a lot of time developing this. So here we have the notion of optic flow. All of you have experienced this before. You probably don't frequently pay attention to it, but the next time you're driving, if you do, it'll be quite salient. So let's say you're driving along and you're heading toward this spot here. The motion on the back of the eye, that part off in the distance will be stationary, and then all the other velocities will, points will move out in a radial direction, and as they get farther from the fixation point, their velocities will increase. So this is a standard pattern of optic flow. This is what you would simulate in a flight simulator if you want to get someone to think that they're actually flying or driving in a car. This is the kind of pattern of motion that you would want to try to create. All right, so we've got a bunch of cognitive engineers in the class. Suppose you're flying an airplane and you see this pattern of flow. What's it telling you? Where's the focus of expansion? Is it back there on the horizon? What do we know about the horizon? It's at optical infinity. So if you see the pattern of expansion, the focus of expansion on the horizon, what that's telling the pilot is you're flying at a level altitude. Now, if the pilot looks outside the plane, if the pilot looks out the side of the plane, not outside of, this is what they would see. So they'd see this pattern of motion parallax, again, where the vanishing point is here on the horizon. So this is also telling you that you're flying at a constant altitude, which is generally what you want to do if you're flying an airplane. What's this one telling you? All right. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Yeah, but what is the structure here? It's a landing strip. Right? So what's the pilot have to do in order to land the plane? Right? You have to see a flow like this until you're just about to hit the damn thing, and then what do? Then you level out. Well, a little bit later in the class, we have to discuss how you know when it's just before you're going to hit, because that's an important part of this strategy. But anyway, this is telling you, now let's say you were going to miss the landing strip for any reason. How would you know that? Remember, where you're heading is where the focus of expansion is. So the fact that the focus of expansion is on the landing strip means you're heading toward the landing strip. If the focus of expansion was over here, then you better make a correction. Unless you want to land in the grass or whatever happens to be on the other side of the strip. Any ideas what this pattern of motion is telling you? All right, so you got some points in your eye moving in one direction, other points moving in the opposite direction. All right, come on back up. Come on back up. All right, I want you to do the same trick as before, except I want you to focus on the guy in the blue shirt's nose.
Oh, okay. There we go. I was focusing really hard. Yeah, it's hard to. There's definitely a difference between the motion at or behind Luke's nose and in front of Luke's nose.
Right, so in front of him, everybody's moving in one direction.
Yeah.
And behind him, everybody's moving in the opposite direction. So that's what's happening here, right? You're traveling laterally, but you're fixating on some point in the environment. So that point, because you're fixating on it, is going to stay fixed. But that alters the nature of the flow field. Now I realize how disturbing it is to focus on your nose, but you had a bright blue shirt. I had to pick on you. Any questions about optic flow before I move on? All right, let's make it a little bit more complex. So let's suppose now that you're driving a car. And you have this pattern of optic flow. Is that a good thing? What do you think?
Probably not. I don't know.
Where are you heading? You're heading right there.
Oh, okay.
And you're traveling in a straight line and you're heading right there. What if you continued on that heading, what would happen?
We'd go off the road.
And is that a good thing?
No.
Right? So what you want to do in this case is you want to alter the behavior of the car to get something that looks like this. So in this case, the flow lines are tracking the road. Right? So if you're going along a curved path and you want the car to move in the same curved path, you want those flow lines to track the road. Now, if you're not curving enough, you get something that looks like this, where the curved lines are converging off the road, and this is not a good thing. So when we're driving, again, you don't notice this, but when you're driving, you're tuned into this information. This is the primary information you use for walking and driving. And so you're doing this all the time. You're not paying any attention to it. It's happening at a fairly low level of neural processing. But we're very good at this sort of thing. And this is one of the primary sources of information that we use to navigate through the world. Now, Gibson proposed this stuff back in 1950. But interestingly, the first, well, I take that back. There were a couple of earlier experiments before 1988. There's a guy down at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base who did some studies of people's sensitivity to optic flow, but it wasn't a particularly good experiment. Warren and Hannon, Bill Warren was a graduate student with me. He's one of my best friends. And he's a professor at Brown University, and he's one of the world's experts in the visual control of action. So you'll be hearing a lot about Bill Warren over the next 3 lectures. So their first study by Warren and Hanna, they invented a new paradigm, which people still use today to study this. And so the idea is you're going to see a pattern of optic flow for a while, and then the flow will stop, and a bar will appear on the surface, and you have to say whether you were moving in a way that would cause you to pass to the left of the bar or to the right of the bar. Simple task. All right, so we'll show it again. So here's the flow. Would you pass to the left of the bar or the right of the bar?
Left.
All right, let's try this one over here. Left or right?
Right.
All right, so pretty easy. Now, I made this actually trivially easy. So in Warren's experiment, what they would do is they would have really small increments relative to where the bar was. And what he did was he attempted to measure the threshold, just how different does your heading point have to be relative to the bar in order to detect correctly whether you're going to move to the left or right. And if memory serves me well, I think he found that 1 or 2 degrees would suffice. Now, there's another problem that he was interested in. Oh yeah, it says 1 or 2 degrees. The other thing he wanted to look at is, all right, what if you're doing this task while you're moving your eyes? Now, if you think of Gibson's focus of expansion, it largely oversimplifies what the problem is. So if your eyes are fixed in your head and you're moving through the world, the focus of expansion tells you exactly where you're heading. However, what if you're moving your eyes at the same time you're moving through the world? Now you got a complication, because you've got one part of the flow field where there's a focus of expansion and everything else is radiating from it. But then you've got another part of the flow field that's caused by the motion of your eyes, which is causing everything to move in a constant velocity across the back of the retina. And what that does basically is it moves if you're moving your eyes, it moves the focus of expansion from one place to another. So here's what the flow field looks like. You see all the vectors converging on that post, which is where you're heading. But now if you're moving your eyes, say to track this dot right here, now all the vectors move in the same direction. Now an actual flow field while you're moving your eyes would be the sum of these two things, which would look something like this. So in this case, the focus of expansion isn't helping you. Right? Focus of expansion isn't telling you where it's heading here. In order to do that, you got to somehow factor out the eye movement. Now, how might you do that? I already told you one way you could do it. You could use your motor commands to your muscles. That would be the von Holst procedure. Right? So if you're moving your eyes, your brain is making commands to your muscles. Those commands then are counteracting part of the motion that you're detecting perceptually, and basically you just get rid of this part and you're reduced to that. However, and so, oh, by the way, so when Warren and Hanna did this experiment, what they found was essentially subjects were equally good if they were moving toward an object and their eyes were stationary as they were if they were moving toward an object and their eyes are moving. So what this tells us is it is possible to factor out your eye movements when you're heading through the environment. That's what these data show. So in one case, the way you do this experiment is you have the same bar as before, but in one case you just look straight ahead, and in the other case there's a dot on the screen that you're required to track. Right? So when you track the dot on the screen, that causes your eyes to move, but you can still do the task even if your eyes are moving. That's what these data show. So this is showing how correct you are at judging, am I going to pass to the left of the bar or the right of the bar, as a function of the heading. So this would be when you're traveling 6 degrees to the right. This would be you're only traveling 1 degree to the right. So the threshold is somewhere between 1 and 2 degrees. And it's not affected by whether your eyes are moving or whether your eyes are stationary. So the question then that occupied about 15 years of research, every year there's a big vision meeting I tell you about a lot called the Vision Science Society meeting that meets in Florida every May. And for about 15 years there are a number of groups, probably about 6 or 7, that would all do a bunch of papers where they would argue about how it is that you're able to separate out the motions of your body from the motion of your eyes. And it turns out that there are several sources of information that allow you to do that. So one of them I've already discussed. It's these extraretinal signals. So in this case, the basic idea is I make a command to my muscles, and then I can use that to gauge how my eyes are moving, assuming that the eyes are going to do what the muscles are telling them to do. The other uses a thing called differential invariance. And let me take some time to flesh that out for you. All right, I'm going to ignore the math. How many of you have had calculus before? How many of you got into your third semester of calculus? A few of you. And did you do vector fields when you did that?
Yeah.
All right, and did they tell you how to decompose vector fields?
Yeah, it's been a while, but.
All right, well, here's a summary of what they told you. So basically, we don't have to treat this mathematically at all. And I've actually covered it when we talked about area MT in the temporal cortex. And I said there were cells that detected looming, and there were cells that detected rotation. So in the theory of vector fields, if you have a looming response like this, or pulling away, that's referred to as divergence. And it's pretty easy to detect. As I said, there's cells in the medial temporal cortex of humans that are specifically sensitive to this pattern of motion. The other one is curl. So that is the visual image is just rotating. There are also cells in the medial temporal cortex that are specifically sensitive to that. And that's called curl. Then there's a third one that may seem a little obvious. So this would be a display that in one direction, the motions are moving toward one another, whereas in an orthogonal direction, they're moving away from one another. And this is referred to as shear. And there's a theorem in vector calculus that you can take any possible pattern of velocities and any possible continuous pattern of velocities and break them down into these three components. All right, so the important thing here, we don't have to know the math. It's just you have things looming, things rotating, or things that are compressing in one direction and expanding in the orthogonal direction. So that's differential invariance. And so there's a model I'll tell you about that uses differential invariance to pull apart the eye movements from the motions of the body. And then finally, there's another model that uses motion parallax. So the idea here, you can all do this from yourself. Hold up two fingers, like so. Move your head back and forth. And do your fingers move at different rates on the back of your eye when you do that? You all agree? All right. Now put your fingers at the same depth and do the same thing. Now the fingers move at the same velocity on the back of your eye. So what motion parallax does is you get this differential velocity when you have objects, nearby objects that are at different depths from one another. And it turns out you can use that information to also separate your eye movements from the motion of other objects. All right, now in order to test this, what Warren and Hannon did is they did a really clever paradigm. Remember in the first experiment I told you about, right? So you're moving in this field of dots, up, it stops, a bar appears, and you have to say, am I going to the left or going to the right? And if I do it when my eyes are fixed, you can use the focus of expansion to tell you where you're heading. The other condition they ran is with a moving eye condition. In that case, they had a little dot that the subjects would track and move their eyes as they track the dot. And then they had to do the same task. Would they move to the left or the right of the bar when the motion stopped? And the subject could do the task either way. Now, what Warren and Hanna speculated is that if subjects are using this extraretinal signal in order to do that separation, they have to actually move their eyes. That's a strong prediction from that model. As opposed to, if they use one of these models, actually making an eye movement is not really critical. So in principle, subjects can keep their eyes stationary, and if the motion display simulated what would happen if you were moving your eyes, you ought to still be able to do the task. Everybody following me on this? So the subject is going to see exactly the same pattern of motion in two conditions. In one condition, they're moving forward over the ground plane, and they're moving their eyes at the same time. In the other condition, they see exactly the same pattern of motion, but they're not moving their eyes. So the researcher in making the display is modeling a pattern of flow that would happen if they had been moving their eyes. So what's the prediction from that? If actually making an eye movement is contingent, it's necessary in order to do that separation, then their performance ought to break down when they're not moving their eyes and they're just having a simulated motion from a simulated eye movement. But the results showed that that wasn't the case. So here's the moving eye condition and the simulated eye movement condition, and performance is basically the same. So what this is telling us is that extraretinal signals are not a necessary condition in order to solve this problem. Note, that does not mean they're not a sufficient condition, it just means they're not necessary. So we've seen many times in this course that the brain can have multiple strategies to do the same thing. And just to telegraph where I'm heading, we're going to say the same thing here. There's not just one way to solve this problem. All right, so given that they don't need extraretinal signals, all right, let's concentrate now on these two. Now, it turns out that differential invariance, if you want to use divergence, curl, and shear in order to solve this problem, the flow field has to be continuous. So that model works fine if you're running around along a ground plane. But can anybody think of a natural situation where you have to navigate where that wouldn't be the case? So what would the flow look like if you were running through a forest? All right, so I might have a tree here and a tree back there, and they're going to move at different rates. Right? It's not a smooth surface. So the differential invariant model would not work in that situation. So what did Warren Hannon do? They said, well, all right, let's test to see if subjects can separate their eye movements from their body movements with real and simulated motions if they're running through a forest. And this is what the flow fields look like here. So this is a 3D cloud of dots. And here's what it looks like if you add an eye. So if you've got no eye movements going on, then you can still use the focus of expansion in this case. But if you do have an eye movement, then the focus of expansion is not where you're actually heading. Now, the main thing to note in this diagram is you see a bunch of points here where the vectors are in different directions that are right next to one another. Those are the informative features of this flow field. So they're the ones that are exploited by motion parallax, which would allow you to separate your eye movements from your body movements. And when they tested that with an actual moving eye or with a simulated moving eye, no difference. So now we've done what? We've eliminated the extraretinal signals. How did we do that? That's with the simulated eye movement condition. You're not actually moving your eye, so the extraretinal signal is not going to work as a source of information. We've eliminated the differential invariance How do we eliminate that? Well, we're running through the forest and we don't have a smooth flow field, and those invariants aren't well defined. So he systematically excluded these two things, and now we're down to motion parallax. And so if you're using motion parallax, how would you break that model? Remember, I told you, lots of motion parallax if I've got two things at different depths while I move. No motion parallax if I've got everything at the same depth while I move. So can anybody give me a situation where you're moving and all points are at the same depth? What would happen if you were approaching the wall here? All those points are at the same depth. So suppose there's no other structure in the environment, you're just approaching a brick wall. You have flow on the brick wall, but because all the points are at the same depth, there's no motion parallax. So if the way you solve this problem is using motion parallax, that should really screw you up. Okay, so here's what we get in this case. Here you're moving to a planar surface. All points are at the same depth. You're actually headed here. The focus of expansion is over here because you're moving your eyes. And the question is, can we solve the problem then? And notice there are no crossing vectors here like they were here. Right? It's this nastiness, non-smoothness in the field is the motion parallax that lets you solve the problem mathematically. But if I'm going toward a flat wall, whoops, then that information goes away. So what do you think should happen? Give me a prediction. If observers use motion parallax, what should happen when I do this experiment?
So if there is like real movement, it should be like. I'm sorry.
Well, it's either a real movement or a simulated movement. So in no case is the focus of expansion where they're actually headed.
It should be simulated.
All right, so motion parallax isn't going to work here. So if motion parallax is the way they solve this problem, then performance ought to be really crappy. That's the key to the test. And it shouldn't matter whether the motion is real or the motion is simulated, right? You're not getting motion parallax in either of those. Remember, in the motion real, motion simulated, the only reason that's there is to exclude the extraretinal signal model in the case of the simulated motion. It doesn't make any difference for the other two models. And here's what the results look like. So where you actually move your eye, subjects do great. But in the simulated motion case, they're completely clueless. They're at chance. Anybody want to venture a guess at what this tells you? Now, I remember the first time I saw this data, my friend Bill Warren said, okay, this result shows that we must be using motion parallax in the simulated motion case, because we can't do it here, but we can do it here. So that's strong evidence for motion parallax. And that was the end of his story. And I couldn't resist. And I raised my hand. And I said, Bill, what do you do about this case? What does that tell you? Any guesses? Yes?
The flap is something we talked about earlier in the semester about telling depths based on eye movements and stuff like this, and factoring both of them together to come up with a solution.
Well, there's no motion parallax here, but there is extraretinal signals. And those extraretinal signals are informative in the moving eye case. They're not informative in the simulated eye movement case. Remember, the parallax model couldn't care less whether your eyes are moving or not. All it cares about is what is the pattern of flow that's stimulating your retina. The extraretinal signal model does care. So in order for it to work, you have to actually move your eyes, because it's the commands to move your eyes which are being used to separate out the eye movements from the body movements. All right, so if you don't have actual eye movements, then you've knocked that system out. But if you don't have motion parallax, you've also knocked that system out. And so now in the simulated case, you're just a chance. You can't solve it at all. But the key result is you can still do it if you're actually moving your eyes. What does that tell us, folks? Theme we've seen throughout this course. Is there one method to solve this problem? You're shaking your head. What are the two methods?
Well, it's the other two models.
One being motion parallax,
And the other being the extra
the other being the extraretinal signals. So the evidence is quite strong. And by the way, before Warren and Anna even did this experiment, we know that the extraretinal signals matter because of the experiments with curare and the experiments with pushing on your eyeball to make it move. So it's clear that extraretinal signals can play a role. What Gibson was saying is they're not the only thing, right? There's other sources of information besides that. But if you knock those other sources of information out, you can still use the extraretinal signals. Now, I should come back as a caveat. So you might want to conclude from this that observers can use extraretinal signals and they can use motion parallax, but they don't use differential invariance. The data here don't really support that notion because there is no condition that was run where you knock out the motion parallax and the extraretinal signals, but you preserve the differential experiments. So I don't know how to do such an, if I knew how to do such an experiment, I would have done it years ago. But the data to date don't necessarily rule out that differential invariance may play a role as well if the others are not available. Any questions about this before I move on? All right, so this is similar to lots of other things we do in the course. I've got 3 possible models. And then we systematically try to narrow down which one is most relevant to human perception. And at least in this case, it appears that 2 of these clearly are, and the third one, the differential invariance, is uncertain. Now this gets us to a general point. I want to generalize from this issue of optical flow and introduce you to a notion called the perception-action cycle. Because we use this for a lot of our motor behavior, right? Any kind of motor behavior that's guided by vision. What happens is you do an action, the action changes what's coming into your sensory inputs. Based on the sensory inputs, you may then change your action. And that's what a perception action cycle is. So you see a pattern of optic flow. So you're trying to determine, am I on a correct path that'll keep me on the road? You see a pattern of optic flow. The flow is telling you you're not on a correct path to stay on the road. What are you going to do?
Turn the wheel? Or?
Turn the wheel, all right? So that causes a motor response. When you turn the wheel, what does that do?
It changes the pattern of flow.
Changes the pattern of flow. Should come back that way. And then you assess, all right, did I correct appropriately? So I'm now traveling down the road, or do I have to turn the wheel a little bit more? This is the perception action cycle. Now, this is a basic aspect of our neurophysiology. As I say, you do this without paying any attention to it. People have been known to be stone cold drunk and, drive for 20 minutes. Occasionally they don't hit anybody. But the question is, if they're completely unconscious, how are they able to drive at all? Because it's happening at a fairly low level of neural processing. And what does that tell us? That tells us that similar mechanism probably exist in much more primitive species than humans. So here's some examples. This is behavior exhibited by a tethered fly. So say you have a fly that's tethered, so it can't actually go anywhere, but it can flap its wings. And it's standing on this pedestal here, and it's in a drum. And let's say the drum rotates like this. Any idea what the fly will do? So the fly will counteract the motion by rotating itself. I'll holler, please help me. Anybody see that old horrible movie, The Fly? The one from the 50s? If you really want, if you want to see how your grandparents lived, what they went to see at the drive-ins, go look at some of the 50s horror movies. One of the good ones would be The Fly. They did another one later with Jeff Goldblum that is more serious, but I forget when the original one was. Anyway, if you put a fly in here and you rotate the drum, the fly will rotate to counteract the optical motion. Similarly, if you put a fly not sitting on a pedestal, but the fly now is actually flying, it's in a rotating drum, right? So fly's flying along. Well, let's say you're a pilot and you're flying along in a rotating drum. You don't know what drum's rotating. And all of a sudden the whole world is rotating. What are you likely to do?
Turn the plane to counteract that motion.
Right, because you think it's your motion that's causing it. And that's precisely what a fly does. All right, let's say the fly is in the drum here, flying along, and the drum rotates this way. What's the fly going to do? It's going to counteract the motion the same way. This motion is called a yaw. Right? So turn to the left or to the right, and it's flying. And this one is called pitch. And so flies will do these counteracting motions all the time. Now again, human pilots do the same thing. So when you have a flight simulator, behaves pretty much like the rotating drum. So if all of a sudden everything in the field starts rotating like so, the pilot in the flight simulator will initiate a roll movement and might get sick because the vestibular system is saying I'm in a roll movement, but the vision system is saying you are in a roll movement. And remember, I've told you many times in this course, when your vestibular system tells you something different from your visual system, the brain's natural response is to throw up. Here's another experiment. Let's say you have, this is Srinivasan, one of the great researchers. He's from New Zealand, works on this stuff with other animals. So suppose you have a bee, and the bee's flying through a tunnel, like so, and both walls are stationary. So if you were a bee and flying through a tunnel, I'll pick on you. If you're a bee and flying through a tunnel, where would you fly?
Through the tunnel out the other side. Like
All right, would you fly right along one of the walls of the tunnel, or would you try to fly in the center?
in the middle.
Why would you want to fly in the middle?
You don't want to hit the wall.
You don't want to hit the wall. If you're a bee, that hurts. All right, so sure enough, if you put bees and you have them fly through a tunnel, they reason just the way you do, and they fly in the center. But now let's say that I take one of the walls and I have the texture on it that moves in the same direction as the bee. Right? How does the bee know where the center of the tunnel is? The center of the tunnel is where you're getting the same optic flow on both sides. And so if the texture on one side is moving, then the bee will move over toward that side so that when it's flying, the two optical flows are equalized. Moves in the opposite direction, the bee moves over to the opposite side. Now, if you change the scale of the texture, it doesn't make any difference. It's only the motion that affects the bee's behavior in this case. I think I probably should quit here. I have an absolute wonderful demo, but I'll show it to you next time. This is probably my favorite experiment in the history of psychology, so I'll leave that as a teaser for Thursday. So let me pass back the exam.